The silence inside the carriage was a living thing, heavy and cold. It pressed in on Alara Vance, more suffocating than the fine wool of her dress, a garment that felt less like clothing and more like the wrapping on a piece of expensive cargo. With every lurch and groan of the wheels, the silence deepened, broken only by the rhythmic creak of leather and the low, mournful sigh of the wind outside. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, a portrait of composure she did not feel. Her gaze was fixed on the window, on the world scrolling past in a panorama of brutal grandeur. The Rocky Mountains, in the late autumn of 1878, were not the picturesque peaks of an artist's canvas. They were colossal, jagged teeth of granite, their stony faces scarred by time and weather, utterly indifferent to the small human drama unfolding at their feet. The sky above was a sheet of pewter, and the wind that scoured the narrow pass carried the first biting premonition of snow, a clean, sharp scent that promised a bitter cold to come. This landscape was a world away from the manicured gardens and predictable seasons of her eastern home. It was vast, untamed, and it felt menacing, as if it could swallow the carriage and its occupants without a trace. She was an asset. That was the word her father had used. His voice strained, his eyes avoiding hers. An asset to be leveraged, a daughter to be sold to save the family from the ruin his poor investments had wrought. Her buyer was a man she had met only twice, Alistair Beaufort. He was a land baron of considerable wealth and influence, a man whose polished manners failed to conceal a chilling possessiveness in his eyes. He had looked at her the way he might look at a prize mare, assessing her breeding and her beauty, calculating her value. In a few days, she would be his wife, her life a transaction completed. The thought settled not with a sharp pang of sorrow, but with a quiet, hollow dread that had become her constant companion. The two men escorting her sat opposite, their faces grim and unreadable. They were hired men, their loyalty bought by Beaufort's gold. One was thick-set with a grizzled beard, the other lean and watchful. They rarely spoke, to her or to each other, their presence a constant reminder of her gilded cage. She was a woman of formal education, fluent in Latin and literature, skilled in botany and the piano. Here, in this world of raw, brutal survival, those accomplishments were as useless as lace in a blizzard. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, a delicate instrument thrust into a blacksmith's forge. The change, when it came, was terrifyingly swift. The wind's mournful sigh escalated into a frantic shriek. The first few flakes of snow, light as feathers, became a thick swirling curtain of white. The world outside the window vanished. The driver's muffled shouts were swallowed by the storm's roar. The carriage, which had been jolting along a treacherous but visible track, suddenly pitched violently, the sound of splintering wood and a horse's scream cutting through the gale. Alara was thrown against the far side of the coach, her head striking the frame with a dull thud. For a moment, there was only chaos, the vortex of white outside, the shouts of the guards, the terrified whinnying of the horses. The carriage tilted at a sickening angle, one wheel caught in a rut or dangling over an unseen edge. One of the guards fumbled with the door, cursing the storm, his pistol drawn. The other peered uselessly into the blizzard. Then, a shape emerged from the maelstrom. It was a single rider, a dark silhouette against the blinding snow, moving with an unnatural calm amidst the fury. There was a crack of a rifle, sharp and definitive. The lead horse screamed and fell, tangling the traces, bringing the carriage to a final, shuddering halt. The lean guard threw the door open, leveling his pistol into the white nothingness. "Who goes there?" he yelled, his voice thin against the wind. The answer was another rifle shot, and the man crumpled back into the carriage without a sound. The grizzled guard bellowed in rage and surprise, scrambling over his fallen companion. He never made it outside. The door was wrenched open, and the dark figure was there, filling the opening. He moved with a predator's economy of motion, a blur of dark wool and grim purpose. There was a brief, brutal struggle, a guttural cry, and then silence returned. Save for the howling of the wind, Alara pressed herself into the corner, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The man turned his attention to her. He was not a boorish brute, red-faced and roaring. He was cold, focused, his movements deliberate. A dark, damp hat was pulled low, but she could see his eyes beneath the brim. They were not wild or crazed. They held a chilling depth of purpose, a gaze that seemed to look straight through her. He said nothing. He reached in, his gloved hand taking hold of a long knife. For a terrible second, she thought he meant to kill her, but he simply sliced through the fine fabric of her dress where it had snagged on the broken door frame, freeing her. Then he reached for her. His grip was like iron on her arm. He hauled her from the wrecked carriage and into the biting fury of the storm. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. Without ceremony, he lifted her and set her on the front of his saddle. He took a rough wool blanket from his saddle roll and wrapped it around her, his movements efficient and impersonal. He swung up behind her, his body a solid wall against the wind, and spurred the horse forward, riding directly into the heart of the blizzard. The world dissolved. There was only the dizzying swirl of snow, the punishing wind, the heat of the strange man's body behind her, and the steady, powerful movement of the horse beneath them. She had been stolen from one cage only to be thrust into another, far more terrifying and unknown. She lost all track of time. The maelstrom was endless, a disorienting universe of white and cold. She drifted in and out of a numb sort of consciousness, her body held secure by the arm locked around her waist. Just when she thought she could endure the cold no longer, that her limbs would simply freeze and snap off, the horse slowed. They descended into what felt like a dip in the terrain, the wind lessening its assault. Through the thinning veil of snow, a shape emerged, a small cabin, nestled in a sheltered valley. Its roof and walls so burdened with snow it seemed to be a part of the landscape itself, a natural outgrowth of wood and stone. A thin tendril of smoke curled from its chimney, a fragile sign of life in the vast, deadening white. He dismounted, pulling her down from the horse with the same unceremonious strength he had used before. Her legs, numb and weak, buckled beneath her, and she would have fallen if not for his grip. He led the horse to a small, snow-laden lean-to beside the cabin, then half-dragged, half-carried her to the solid wooden door. He pushed it open and guided her inside, into a sudden, shocking warmth. The interior was Spartan, built for function, not comfort. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within, its light dancing across the rough-hewn timbers. There was a simple table with 2 stools, a single cot against the far wall, and shelves stocked neatly with sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and jars of preserves. It was a place of solitude, a den built for weathering storms, both literal and figurative. It was orderly, clean, and utterly devoid of any softness. Her captor deposited her on the floor near the hearth as if she were a sack of grain. She crumpled there, the rough blanket still around her shoulders, her fine wool dress now torn and damp. He moved away from her, his attention already elsewhere. He secured the door against the storm, adding a heavy wooden bar. Then he turned, and for the first time, she saw him clearly in the firelight. He was tall and lean, his face hardened by sun and wind. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, but it could not hide the harsh set of his jaw. His movements were spare and certain. He retrieved a length of rope from a peg on the wall and approached her. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She instinctively scrambled backward until her back hit the cold stone of the hearth. He paid her fear no mind. He took her hands, his touch firm but not overtly cruel, and bound her wrists together. Then, he guided her to a sturdy wooden beam that supported the small loft overhead and, with a few deft motions, secured the other end of the rope to it, leaving her tethered with just enough slack to sit or curl up on the floor. He worked with a detached efficiency that was more terrifying than any shouted threat. He did not look at her as a person. He did not speak to her. He did not acknowledge her fear. When he was finished, he simply turned away, moving about the cabin, stoking the fire, checking his rifle. He treated her as an object, a piece of a plan she could not begin to fathom. And in his silent, methodical disregard, she felt her own humanity begin to shrink. The first 24 hours passed in a silent war of wills. Ilara, though gripped by a cold terror that settled deep in her bones, refused to give him the satisfaction of tears or pleas. Her upbringing, for all its decorative qualities, had instilled in her a deep-seated pride. She would not beg, so she watched him. She sat on the hard-packed earth floor, the coarse rope chafing her skin, and she studied her captor. The harsh lines of his face seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains outside. There was a story there, in the slight downward turn of his mouth, in the weary tension around his eyes. She saw a deep, jagged scar that ran from just below his ear along his jawline, disappearing into the rough growth of his beard. It was an old wound, long healed, but it spoke of violence. His hands, though calloused and weathered, were not clumsy. They moved with precision, whether he was adding a log to the fire or cleaning his pistol. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to self-reliance, to a life stripped down to its barest essentials. She endured the discomfort of her bonds, the persistent ache in her shoulders, the cold that seeped up from the floor through her damp dress. Most of all, she endured the gnawing fear that churned in her stomach. Her mind, however, was a torrent of activity. She was a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be pieced together. Why her? It could not be for ransom, not in the traditional sense. Her family had no money. That was the very reason she was in this carriage in the first place. This had to be about Beaufort. Did this man hate him? Did he want to hurt him? And she, the bride-to-be, was the most direct way to do so. She was not a person to him. She was a message. Silas, though she did not yet know his name, was just as observant. He moved about his small domain, pretending to be occupied with his tasks, but he was acutely aware of the woman tied to the post. He watched her from the corner of his eye. He had expected hysterics, pleading, the panicked fragility of a society belle. He saw none of it. He saw a straight spine, a chin held high, and a pair of intelligent, watchful eyes that tracked his every move. She possessed a core of steel that surprised him. It did not please him, but he noted it, filing it away as one might note the unexpected hardness of a piece of wood before taking an axe to it. Late in the day, he cooked a meager meal. He fried slices of salted meat in a pan over the fire and heated a tin of beans. The smell filled the small cabin, making Ilara's stomach clench with a hunger she had been too frightened to acknowledge. He filled a tin plate for himself and ate standing by the fire, his back mostly to her. When he was finished, he prepared a second plate and filled a cup with water from a bucket near the door. He walked over and pushed them onto the floor, just within her reach. The act was devoid of kindness, a simple necessity. An asset had to be kept alive. She stared at the food, with her hands bound in front of her. Eating would be a clumsy, humiliating affair. She hesitated, her pride warring with the primal demands of her body. Silas watched her, his face impassive. He saw the struggle in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands. He waited for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he nudged the plate a few inches closer with the toe of his boot, a minuscule gesture that somehow felt more insulting than if he had done nothing at all. Swallowing her pride, Ilara awkwardly managed to eat, using her fingers to scoop the beans and tear at the tough meat, feeling more like an animal in a cage than a woman in a room. The second night, the storm returned with a vengeance. It had lulled during the day, but now it threw its full weight against the small cabin. The wind howled like a banshee, a physical pressure against the walls, and the timbers groaned in protest. A draft snaked in from under the door, a current of pure, Arctic cold. Despite the fire, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. Ilara, weakened by shock and the unrelenting chill of the past 2 days, began to shiver. At first, it was a minor tremor, but it soon grew into a violent, uncontrollable shuddering that shook her entire frame. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. She curled herself into the tightest ball she could manage, pulling the thin wool blanket tighter, but it was useless against the insidious cold that was seeping into her very marrow. A deadly numbness began to creep into her fingers and toes. She was no longer just a captive. She was a woman in real, imminent danger of freezing to death. Silas sat by the hearth, on the single stool, sharpening the long blade of his hunting knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound inside besides the storm's fury and the chattering of her teeth. For a long time, he did not look at her. He seemed lost in the repetitive motion, his focus absolute, but the sound of her shivering grew more frantic, more desperate. It was a sound of a body losing its fight for survival. Finally, he stopped. He lifted his head and truly looked at her. In the flickering firelight, he saw the bluish tint on her lips, the pale, waxy sheen of her skin. He saw the genuine, life-threatening peril she was in. For the first time since he had taken her, his cold facade cracked. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not pity, not compassion, but a primal, animal recognition of a fellow creature's struggle against the elements, against the killing cold that made no distinction between outlaw and lady. He rose to his feet, his movements still deliberate but now imbued with a clear sense of urgency. He threw another heavy log onto the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Then he crossed the room to her. She flinched as his shadow fell over her, her eyes wide with fear. He ignored her reaction, pulling the knife from his belt. Her breath hitched, but he simply knelt and, with one swift, clean motion, sawed through the thick rope that bound her to the beam. The sudden release of tension in her arms was a shock. He did not untie her wrists, but left them bound together in front of her. He stood and pulled the single rough cot from its place against the wall, dragging it closer to the hearth, into the pocket of greatest warmth. He gestured toward it with the knife, a silent command, hesitantly, stiffly. Ilara scrambled onto it, huddling on the thin mattress. Silas turned to the corner where he himself slept on a pile of furs on the floor. He took the heaviest of them, a massive, thick bearskin, and carried it to the cot. He draped it over her, the weight of it a sudden, surprising comfort. He tucked it in tightly around her shoulders and feet, sealing her in a cocoon of warmth. He did not speak a single word. His expression was as unreadable as the granite peaks outside, but the act itself was a profound, seismic shift in their dynamic. He had moved from captor to a reluctant, ungentle protector. He had acknowledged her not as an object, but as a life that was in danger of being extinguished. Ilara lay under the heavy fur, the violent shivering slowly subsiding into a deep tremor. The bearskin smelled of pine smoke, of leather, and of the man himself, a wild, clean scent. Through her lashes, she watched him as he returned to his stool by the fire, his back to her once more. The silence that descended was different now. It was heavier, freighted with unspoken questions, with the terrifying vulnerability she had just shown, and with the first fragile thread of a human connection, spun in the heart of a blizzard. In the absolute isolation at the edge of the world had shrunk to the four walls of the cabin, cocooned in a universe of white. The blizzard did not break. It settled in, a permanent and oppressive guest, sealing them away from whatever world existed beyond the snow-choked valley. The immediate, sharp-toothed threat of freezing had passed for Ilara, replaced by a low, simmering tension that was in some ways more exhausting. She woke on the cot, the heavy bearskin a comforting weight, the fire in the hearth a pulsing orange heart in the dim room. Her wrists were still bound, the coarse rope a constant, chafing reminder of her situation. But her situation had changed. She was no longer tethered to the beam. She was on the cot, and he was on the floor. He had taken a thinner blanket for himself, sleeping on the hard-packed earth near the fire. The new proximity was a source of immense, unspoken strain. In the deep quiet of the snow-insulated cabin, every sound was magnified. She could hear the soft hiss and pop of the burning logs, the faint, ever-present moan of the wind, and the sound of his breathing. It was a slow, steady rhythm in the darkness, the sound of a life separate from her own, yet inextricably bound to it. When the firelight shifted, his shadow would stretch and move against the wall, a looming, silent giant. She was acutely aware of him in a way that went beyond fear. She was aware of the latent power in his stillness, the coiled energy he held in reserve. He was a force of nature, as unpredictable and dangerous as the storm that had trapped them. Days blurred into a single, gray twilight, marked only by the simple routines of survival. They did not speak. The silence was his territory, and she had not yet found the courage to trespass. The routine was their only language. In the morning, he would rise, stoke the dying embers of the fire back to life, and then venture out into the blinding white to a sheltered spot beside the cabin, returning with a bucket of clean snow to be melted for water. He would prepare a breakfast of hard biscuits and bitter coffee. He would push her portion to the edge of the cot and retreat to his own space to eat. They existed in these orbits, separate but always aware of the other's gravitational pull. She was allowed to move about the cabin now, a limited freedom within the confines of her cage. The rope that bound her wrists was long enough for her to tend to her own needs, to pace the small space, to stand by the single, snow-caked window and stare out at the shifting, formless landscape of the storm. In this forced intimacy, their defenses began the slow, inevitable process of erosion. It was impossible to maintain a wall of pure terror or cold indifference when you could hear the other person sigh in their sleep. It was on the third day, or perhaps the fourth, she was no longer certain, that she decided to break the silence. He was tending the fire, his back to her. She watched the focused set of his shoulders, the careful way he placed a new log on the flames. "What is your name?" Her voice was quiet, but in the profound stillness of the cabin, it sounded as loud as a gunshot. He froze, his hand hovering over the fire. He did not turn, did not move for a long count of heartbeats. She thought perhaps he would not answer, that he would continue to treat her as a nameless object. The silence stretched, becoming a taut, vibrating wire between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rasp, unused to conversation. "Silas." The name hung in the air, a solid, tangible thing. It was the first piece of himself he had given her, the first crack in the anonymous facade of captor. It changed the shape of the room. He was no longer just a silhouette, a force. He was Silas. She waited a moment before speaking again, her own voice firmer this time. "My name is Ilara, not the girl, not Beaufort's property. Ilara." He turned his head then, just enough to look at her over his shoulder. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting instant, she saw something flicker in their depths. Surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, then turned back to the fire. But the exchange was made. The first stones of a bridge had been laid across the chasm that separated them. The titular moment, the one that would alter everything, arrived out of a convergence of desperation and a calculated gamble. The rough rope had rubbed her wrists raw. The skin was red and tender, and the cold seemed to concentrate in the tight bands. A constant, icy burn. In the evenings, when the temperature dropped and the fire seemed to shrink in on itself, the pain became a miserable, consuming ache. She was watching him. He had stripped off his heavy outer shirt to tend to a small wound on his forearm, a shallow cut he must have received during the ambush at the carriage. He cleaned it with a rag dipped in whiskey, his movements precise and practiced. There was a profound and terrible loneliness in his self-sufficiency, in the way he tended his own wounds without a flinch or a word. He was a man utterly alone, walled off not just by the storm, but by something deeper and far older. She was beginning to recognize the shape of it. It looked like grief. That evening, the fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. The cold pressed in from the corners of the room, a palpable, living presence. Silas sat on his stool, staring into the flames, lost in a place she could not see. She gathered her courage, her voice a low whisper that was meant only for him, a sound to slide under his defenses rather than confront them. "The ropes are freezing my skin," she said. Her gaze was steady, fixed on his shadowed profile. He did not move, but she knew he was listening. "I cannot get warm like this." She paused, letting the simple, desperate truth of her words settle in the space between them. "If you untie me," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "I'll show you warmth." The words were a desperate plea, an offer of shared humanity. They carried a subtle, unavoidable undertone of intimacy, a meaning that was both more and less than he might suspect. It was not a seductive ploy. She had no illusions about her power in this situation. It was a raw appeal from one human being to another in the face of a vast, killing cold. It was a promise to not be a threat, to not be a problem, to simply share the small, vital heat of existence. "Let me be a person, and I will help you feel like one, too." That was the real meaning. Silas turned his head slowly and looked at her. His face was a mask of conflict. His eyes narrowed as he tried to parse the meaning behind her words, searching for the trap. He was an outlaw. He had survived this long by trusting no one, by seeing the angle in every offer, the threat in every kindness. Her words were a direct challenge to his entire way of life. They demanded a currency he no longer believed he possessed: trust. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity. The fire crackled. The wind moaned. He saw the raw honesty in her eyes, the deep exhaustion that lay beneath her resilient surface, the faint, uncontrollable tremor in her hands. He saw a fellow creature, trapped and fighting for survival, offering the only thing she had left to give: a promise. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from the stool. He walked over to the cot, his boots making no sound on the earthen floor. He loomed over her, a dark and intimidating shape. He pulled the long knife from the sheath on his belt. Alara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. But she did not flinch. She held his gaze. With a single, clean slice, he cut the rope that bound her wrists. The freedom was a sudden, sharp shock to her system. The blood rushed back into her hands with a painful, tingling surge. She brought her hands up, rubbing the raw, chafed skin of her wrists, her eyes never leaving his. The red welts were an ugly testament to her captivity. He said nothing. He simply stood there for a second longer, his expression unreadable, then gave one sharp nod. He returned to his spot by the fire, turning his back to her, presenting a facade of indifference that she knew, somehow, he did not feel. The space between them was now charged with a new and fragile thing. True to her word, she made the first small gesture. He had set a tin cup of water by the fire to heat for himself. When it was warm, she rose from the cot, her movements stiff. She picked up the cup, the metal warm against her cold fingers, and walked over to him. She held it out. "Here," she said softly. He did not look at her. But after a moment's hesitation, his hand came up and took the cup from her. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch of calloused skin against hers. It was nothing, and it was everything. Later that night, as she huddled under the immense warmth of the bearskin, she saw him shiver in his sleep on the floor, curled under his single, thin blanket. He had given her the better place, the greater warmth, without thinking. She pushed a large section of the heavy fur off the side of the cot, letting it drape down to cover him where he lay. He stirred, a low sound in his throat, and settled into its warmth. These small acts of shared survival, of mutual care, began to build a fragile bridge across the silence. The psychological turning point, the moment the bridge became a path, occurred 2 nights later. Emboldened by his acceptance of her small gestures, she began to ask quiet questions. She did not pry, did not demand. She asked about the mountains, about the snow, simple things about the world that was his and was now hers. He answered in monosyllables at first, then in short, grudging sentences. He was like a man coaxing a painful memory from a deep well. That night, she asked him about the scar on his jaw. He stopped stirring the pot of stew he was making for their supper. His hand tightened on the wooden spoon. "It was a gift," he said, his voice flat, "from a friend of your fiancé." The name, Beaufort, landed like a stone in the quiet cabin. It was the first time it had been spoken between them. "You know Alistair Beaufort?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas let out a short, harsh sound that was not a laugh. "Oh, I know him." He set the spoon down with a clatter and turned to face her, his eyes burning with a cold fire she had not seen before. "I know him better than any man alive." And then, as if a dam had finally broken, he began to talk. It was not a confession, not a plea for sympathy. It was a slow, painful unraveling of his past. The words pulled from him like splinters from a wound. His name was Silas Cole. He had not always been an outlaw. Once, he had been a rancher. He and his wife, Sarah, had owned a small, prosperous spread in a valley 2 days south of Beaufort's vast holdings. It was good land, with a creek that ran year-round and grass that grew thick and tall. They had a son, Jacob, a boy with his mother's laugh and a wild thatch of sun-bleached hair. They had not been rich, but they had been happy. Their life had been simple, and it had been whole. But the land was good, and Alistair Beaufort coveted it. He needed their creek to water his ever-expanding herds. He made an offer, a generous one, but Silas refused. The land was his home. It held the memory of his father and the future of his son. It was not for sale. Beaufort did not like being told no. He used his wealth, his power. He had the local law in his pocket. One day, the sheriff and 2 deputies rode out to the ranch. They accused Silas of rustling cattle from Beaufort's herd. It was a lie, a fabrication, but Beaufort had produced witnesses, men on his payroll who would say anything for a few gold coins. Silas was arrested, protesting his innocence, and taken away to the county jail. He never saw his family again, while he sat in a cell, waiting for a trial that was already decided. Beaufort's men paid a visit to his ranch. They called it an accident, a lantern knocked over in the barn, a stray spark on a dry wind. But Silas knew. He knew it was Beaufort's work. The fire spread to the house. Sarah and Jacob were trapped inside. By the time Silas heard the news, it was too late. By the time he managed to escape, driven by a grief so vast it became a white-hot rage, he had lost everything. His home was a pile of charred timbers. His wife and son were gone, buried in a small plot on a hill overlooking the ashes. He was a wanted man, a fugitive with a price on his head, a man with nothing left to lose. He became an outlaw with a single, burning purpose: to ruin Alistair Beaufort, to dismantle his empire, to bleed him dry, and to take from him everything he held dear. "He was parading you around," Silas said, his voice raw with a bottomless grief. "His beautiful, cultured bride from the East, his newest, most valuable possession. I didn't take you for money. Ilara, I took you to take you from him, to show him what it feels like to have the thing you value most ripped away." His story fell into the silent cabin, and the world tilted on its axis. Ilara listened, her hands pressed to her mouth, a wave of horror and nausea washing over her. The image of her fiancé, the merely undesirable, possessive man, dissolved. In his place stood a monstrous villain, A man who built his empire on the ashes of other people's lives, on the bodies of a woman and a child. She had thought she was being stolen from civilization by a savage. She realized now she had been a pawn in a war she never knew existed, stolen from one monster by another. But as she looked at Silas, at the naked, devastating pain that had carved itself into his face, she could not see him as just a monster. She saw a man hollowed out by sorrow, a man whose entire existence had been reshaped by the evil of another. A profound, aching wave of empathy washed through her, so powerful it left her breathless. He was not her enemy. She, too, was a victim of Beaufort's ambition, a piece of property to be acquired and displayed. Her captivity had not begun in the blizzard. It had begun the moment her father signed the marriage contract. Softly, her own voice thick with unshed tears, she told him about her own gilded cage, about the family duty that felt like a death sentence, about Beaufort's cold, assessing eyes, about the suffocating feeling of being a prized mare sold to the highest bidder to settle a debt. They were not captor and captive anymore. That dynamic had been burned away by the terrible truth. They were two people trapped in the same web, spun by the same spider. Their tragedies were different in scale, but they were intertwined, two separate threads of pain originating from the same dark place. In the flickering firelight of the snowbound cabin, they looked at each other and for the first time, truly saw. They saw the reflection of their own pain in the other's eyes, and there, in the desolate soil of their shared sorrow, the first true seeds of a deep and complicated love began to grow. The revelation of their shared enemy settled over the cabin like a fresh fall of snow, muffling the old sounds of fear and replacing them with a silence that was entirely new. It was not empty. It was dense with unspoken emotion, with the shared weight of two broken pasts. The last vestiges of the captor-captive relationship dissolved, not in a sudden rush, but in a slow, quiet thaw, leaving behind a tentative alliance forged in the crucible of their mutual grief. The tension that remained was no longer the sharp edge of dread, but the low, humming frequency of a burgeoning and dangerous intimacy. Silas changed. The shift was subtle at first, a difference in the way he looked at her. He no longer saw an object, a piece of his revenge. He saw a person, an unwilling participant in his tragedy, and a victim in her own right. He began to speak to her not in commands or grunts, but in full sentences. He began to treat her as an equal. One afternoon, as the endless snow continued to fall, he laid their dwindling supplies out on the rough-hewn table. A half-full sack of flour, a dwindling pile of dried meat, a handful of potatoes, a tin of coffee that was mostly empty. "We have maybe 4 days," he said, his voice flat. 5, if we are careful. It was not an order or a threat. It was a statement of fact, an invitation for her input. Elara looked at the meager provisions, her mind, so long accustomed to academic problems, turning to this new, practical one. "The flour could be stretched," she said, thinking aloud. "If we make a thin gruel instead of biscuits and add shaved slivers of the potatoes, it will be more filling." She looked at the dried meat. "And if you have snares, there must be rabbits or squirrels, even in this weather. They would seek shelter in the trees at the edge of the valley. A small amount of fresh meat would make a great difference." Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had seen her as a lady, soft and breakable. He had not considered that her mind, honed on books and complex ideas, could be a tool for survival. He nodded slowly. "I have snares," he said, and the next morning he went out and set them. They were partners now, their minds and skills intertwined in the simple, desperate business of staying alive. She, in turn, found a strength she never knew she possessed. The quiet dread that had plagued her in the carriage was gone, burned away by the far hotter fires of immediate peril and righteous anger. She was no longer a passive asset waiting to be claimed. She was a survivor. She learned to read the moods of the fire, to bank the coals at night so a few embers would remain in the morning. She learned to stitch a tear in his shirt with a fishbone and a piece of thread unraveled from her own petticoat. Her Eastern education had not prepared her for this life, but it had given her a sharp, analytical mind, a tool that proved just as vital as his knife or his rifle. His raw, practical knowledge of the wilderness and her thoughtful, methodical approach to problems made them a surprisingly effective team. Their conversations deepened, meandering away from the dark shadow of Alistair Beaufort and into the quieter, more painful territory of their lost lives. In the long evenings, with a storm whispering outside, they would talk, their voices low in the firelight. Silas spoke of the simple life he had lost, his words rough and hesitant, as if he were handling a memory too fragile to bear much weight. He described the feel of good, dark soil crumbling in his hands in the spring, the satisfaction of a solid fence post sunk deep into the earth. He spoke of the sound of his son's laughter, a sound he said was like a fistful of coins being thrown in the air, bright and careless. He talked about his wife, Sarah, about the way she would hum when she was baking, a tuneless, happy sound that had been the constant background music of his life. As he spoke, Alara saw the outlaw recede, and in his place was a husband and a father, a man whose heart had been torn from his chest. In turn, she confessed her own, quieter dreams. She told him of her love for books, not just for the stories they held, but for their physical presence, the smell of old paper and leather, the weight of them in her hands. She spoke of botany, of her fascination with the secret life of plants, their resilience, their silent, inexorable growth. Her dream had been a simple one, to study them, to have a small conservatory of her own, to create gardens. It was a life of quiet growth and creation that had been denied to her, traded away for a loveless marriage that would have been its own kind of death. In these moments, they were not Silas Cole, the wanted outlaw, and Alara Vance, the runaway bride. They were just a man and a woman, stripped bare of their titles and histories, sharing the fundamental human ache for a life of purpose and of love. The physical attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface, a dangerous undercurrent in their shared space, became a palpable force, impossible to ignore. The cabin was too small, their proximity too constant. It manifested in small, charged moments that arced between them like static electricity. Their hands would brush as she passed him a piece of firewood, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. She would be rebraiding her hair by the fire, her fingers weaving the long strands, and she would look up to find his gaze on her, intense and unwavering. Before he would quickly look away, he became acutely aware of the line of her neck, the soft curve of her wrist, the way the firelight caught the deep auburn highlights in her hair. She, in turn, was intensely aware of the breadth of his shoulders, the quiet power in his hands, the way he moved with a lean, predator's grace even in the confines of the small room. The harsh, primal setting had stripped away all artifice, all the polite rituals of courtship. What was left was something raw and essential. Desire here was not a gentle flame to be coaxed. It was a force of nature, as powerful and undeniable as the blizzard that raged outside their door. The day that changed everything began with a sound of imminent collapse. A deep, groaning crack echoed from the ceiling. A fine dusting of snow filtered down between the timbers. The immense, accumulated weight of the storm was threatening to break the cabin's spine. There was no time for discussion. Silas was on his feet instantly, grabbing a spare beam from under the cot. "The main cross support," he yelled over the screech of straining wood. "We have to brace it." For the next 2 hours, they worked together in the freezing, desperate cold. He climbed onto the table, muscles straining as he tried to wedge the reinforcing beam into place. She, standing on a stool, used a broken piece of a chair to help him lever it, her arms aching, her teeth chattering. Snow and splinters rained down on them. The roof groaned again, a sound like a dying beast, and the main beam sagged visibly. They pushed with all their might, their breaths pluming in the frigid air. their bodies working in a desperate, synchronized rhythm. With a final, agonizing shove, the support beam slid into place, shoring up the sagging roof. The immediate danger had passed. Exhausted, trembling with cold and exertion, they collapsed onto the floor before the hearth. They were alive. They had saved their shelter. They had saved each other. Silas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, battered flask. Unscrewing the top, he took a long swallow, then handed it to her without a word. The whiskey was raw and fiery, a welcome shock of heat that burned a trail down to her stomach. She coughed, and he almost smiled. She took another, deeper drink and passed it back. They sat in silence, sharing the flask. The comfortable, intimate quiet of two people who had just faced down death together. He looked at her then, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and for the first time she saw past the pain and the anger, past the hardened survivor. She saw a profound vulnerability, a deep and aching loneliness that he had kept hidden behind his walls of rage. He reached out, his movements slow, as if giving her every chance to pull away. His calloused fingers, surprisingly gentle, traced the line of her jaw, a touch that was both a question and a statement. Ilara did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and closed her eyes. It was her surrender. It was her choice. In that moment, she was not a captive, not a victim, not an asset. She was a woman, choosing. When he kissed her, it was not gentle, it was desperate, hungry, a raw and sudden release of all the pent-up grief, loneliness, and longing they had both endured for so long. It was the taste of whiskey and wood smoke and sorrow. It was the kiss of a man starved for human contact and a woman who had never known a touch that was not a transaction. She responded in kind, her arms going around his neck, pulling him closer, answering his desperation with her own. He lifted her and carried her the few feet to the great bearskin rug before the fire, laying her down gently. In the soft, flickering light, they came together. It was an act that was both tender and fierce, a claiming and a healing. Every touch was a defiant gesture of life against the backdrop of death, of warmth against the killing cold that had ruled their world. Here, in this small, hidden place. They were not their pasts, not their tragedies. They were only a man and a woman, finding solace in a fierce, desperate joy in each other's arms. In that moment, their union was absolute. The cabin was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary, the only place in the entire world where they were truly seen, truly known, and truly accepted for exactly who they were. They fell asleep tangled in each other's arms on the bearskin, the fire burning down to embers, the storm finally, blessedly, quiet. For a few short hours, they found a brief, perfect peace. The outside world intruded with the morning sun. It was not a brilliant, hopeful dawn, but a weak, watery light filtering through the one small window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The blizzard had finally broken. The wind had died, leaving behind a world of profound, cathedral-like silence. Ilara woke first, cocooned in his arms, a feeling of safety and rightness washing over her that she had never known. She watched him sleep, his face relaxed, the harsh lines softened. This, she thought, this could be a life. Silas stirred, his eyes opening. He looked at her, and a slow, genuine smile touched his lips. It transformed his face. Chasing away the shadows, he leaned in to kiss her, a soft, morning kiss full of the quiet promises of the night. And then he froze. His eyes were looking past her, toward the window. The smile vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, hard alertness. He untangled himself from her and rose in one fluid, silent motion, moving to the edge of the window, peering out through a small, clear patch in the ice.
"What is it?"
she whispered, sitting up, clutching the bearskin to her chest. He did not answer for a long moment. He was utterly still, a statue carved from granite. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, grim whisper. "Get dressed, now!" She saw it then, too, a dark speck in the vast, blinding whiteness of the valley below. A lone rider, silhouetted against the snow, moving slowly, methodically. A scout. Their time had run out. The peace was shattered. The sanctuary violated. The cold, hard reality of their situation came crashing back in, more brutal than any storm. The final minutes in the cabin were a flurry of frantic, focused activity. The tenderness of the morning, the intimacy of the night before, evaporated, replaced by the grim determination of survivors. There were no wasted words, no panicked movements. They knew they could not stay. To be found here was to be trapped and killed. Silas moved with a deadly efficiency, gathering their meager supplies, his rifle, the small pouch of ammunition, the last of the dried meat, a compass from his saddlebag, his knife. He was once again the outlaw, the man honed by hardship, his every action precise and purposeful. Ilara, proving her resourcefulness, did not cower. She found a small canvas sack and wrapped their remaining food, the handful of potatoes, the last bit of flour, in a piece of cloth. She took the extra blanket and, using strips of leather Silas cut for her, helped him fashion crude snowshoes. They worked together seamlessly, a silent, efficient team, their movements anticipating each other's. When they were ready, they stood for a moment in the center of the room that had been their prison, their sanctuary, their entire world. They shared a last, hard look, a look that contained the fierce intimacy of the night before and the cold dread of the dawn ahead. They were no longer just allies or lovers. They were partners in a desperate fight for their lives. As Silas pushed open the door, letting in a blast of frigid, clean air, they made a silent pact. They would face the thawing wilderness. They would face the hunters. They would face whatever came next, together. They stepped out of the cabin, leaving its brief warmth behind, and ventured into the cold, treacherous, and beautiful world. They left the cabin at dusk, stepping from its fragile sanctuary into a world reborn in ice. The storm had scoured the landscape clean, leaving behind a place of breathtaking, lethal beauty. A full moon climbed a sky of polished obsidian, and its ethereal glow cast the endless sea of snow in shades of silver and blue. Every tree branch was sheathed in a perfect crystal armor, and the jagged peaks that surrounded them were transformed into silent, glittering cathedrals. But the beauty was a mask. The cold was no longer a damp, seeping thing. It was a physical entity, sharp and predatory, biting at any exposed inch of skin. The silence of the wilderness was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. It was broken only by the rhythmic, scraping crunch of their crude snowshoes and the ragged clouds of their own breaths, which froze instantly in the still air. Their goal was to vanish. Silas's plan was to climb higher, to push deeper into the mountains where he knew of game trails and hidden passes that Beaufort's hired men, accustomed to the open plains, would never find. He was a creature of these mountains, and he moved through the frozen world with a quiet, certain confidence that was both reassuring and deeply intimidating. He was in his element. This new chapter of their ordeal was defined by survival, and their partnership was its central pillar. Silas became her teacher, the wilderness his classroom. He taught her how to walk on the snowshoes without wasting motion, how to place her feet to make the least sound, how to breathe the thin, frigid air without burning her lungs. In the stark light of the moon, he would stop and point to the sky, tracing the constellations with a gloved finger. "That's the hunter," he'd say, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the silence. "My father taught me that when you can see him clear, the weather will hold. And that star, the bright one at his heel, that's the one to keep on your right shoulder if you want to travel west." He taught her to read the story the snow told. He showed her the delicate, hopping tracks of a snowshoe hare, the deeper, more deliberate prints of a deer, the ominous, padded trail of a mountain cat. "Everything out here is either hunting or being hunted," he told her, his eyes scanning the endless white. "The trick is to be neither." Ilara, far from being the liability he might have once feared, proved to be incredibly resilient. A deep, primal fear was her constant companion. It lived in the pit of her stomach, a cold knot that never fully loosened. But she learned to channel it, to transform its frantic energy into a fierce, quiet determination. Her body, accustomed to corsets and drawing rooms, screamed in protest against the brutal demands of the journey. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, and her feet were rubbed raw, but she did not complain. She learned, she adapted, she endured. She watched Silas, mimicking his movements, absorbing his lessons, her mind a sharp, focused tool of survival. Her inner strength did not go unnoticed. Silas found himself watching her with a growing sense of awe. He saw the grit beneath the grace, the steel beneath the soft skin. This was not the woman he had pulled from the carriage. That woman had been an object of his revenge. This woman, trudging silently beside him through a frozen hell, was his partner. His respect for her deepened into something more profound, a love that was being forged not in the soft fire of a hearth, but in the harsh, unforgiving crucible of the wild. Their journey was punctuated by moments of intense hardship and stark, quiet intimacy. The days were a grueling march through an endless expanse of white. The nights were a desperate battle against the lethal cold. They would find shelter where they could, often in a hollow scraped out of a deep snowbank at the base of a rocky outcrop. In these makeshift dens, insulated from the wind, they would huddle together for warmth, a single blanket wrapped around both of them, the heavy bearskin beneath them. These moments were devoid of the passionate fire they had discovered in the cabin. This was a deeper, more primal connection, the simple, profound act of two living beings sharing their body heat to keep each other alive. In the deep, star-dusted silence, pressed close together, they would talk in hushed tones, their words weaving a fragile tapestry of warmth in the vast coldness. He told her more stories of the stars, myths his father had passed down to him, simple tales of heroes and beasts set in the sky. She, in turn, drew from the well of her own past. She recited lines of poetry from memory, verses from Keats and Shelley she had learned as a girl. Her soft voice, speaking of Grecian urns and west winds in the immense, silent wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, was a startlingly beautiful and incongruous thing. It was a reminder of a world of art and ideas, a world that felt as distant as the stars he named. In sharing these pieces of themselves, they solidified their bond, two disparate souls finding common ground under the same cold, watchful moon. The threat of pursuit was a shadow that followed them relentlessly. One afternoon, they reached a high, wind-swept ridge that offered a commanding view of the valley they had just traversed. Silas stopped, pulling a small spyglass from his pack. He scanned their back trail for a long time. "What do you see?" Ilara asked, her voice tight with anxiety. He said nothing, just handed the spyglass to her. She raised it with a trembling hand and focused it on the vast expanse of white below. At first, she saw nothing but snow and trees. Then she found them, a line of dark figures, small as ants in the distance, moving slowly but steadily along their trail. A horseman in the lead, followed by a handful of men on foot, the posse. The sight sent a jolt of pure terror through her. They were so relentless, so close. The wilderness no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a closing trap. Her breath hitched, and she felt a wave of dizziness. Silas's hand came to rest on her shoulder, his grip firm and steadying. "Breathe, Ilara," he said, his voice calm, his focus absolute. "Fear is a fire. You can let it burn you up, or you can use it to keep you warm." We knew they were coming. Now we just know where they are." His calmness was an anchor in her sea of panic. He pushed them harder after that, his knowledge of the mountains their only true advantage. The chase became a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across a board of unforgiving snow and ice. Silas led them across treacherous scree slopes where their tracks would be harder to follow, through dense pine forests that offered cover from view, always climbing, always pushing onward. A few days later, their path was blocked by a river. It was not wide, but it was fast and dark, churning with chunks of ice. A thin, treacherous sheet of ice clung to the edges, but the center flowed freely. "We have to cross," Silas said, his jaw tight. "Their tracker will expect us to follow the bank, looking for a safer place. This is the last thing he'll expect." He went first, using the butt of his rifle to test the integrity of the ice. He made it to the other side, then turned, holding out a hand for her. "Slowly," he coached. "Follow my steps." Ilara was exhausted. The endless marching, the gnawing fear, and the meager rations had taken their toll. Her legs felt heavy as lead. She took a careful step onto the ice, then another. She was halfway across when the ice groaned beneath her foot. A spider web of cracks shot out, and before she could even cry out, the surface gave way. The shock of the lethally cold water was like being stabbed with 1,000 knives. It stole her breath, paralyzed her limbs. The current was a powerful, unseen monster, pulling her down, tangling her in her heavy skirts. She flailed, her head going under, the dark, freezing water filling her mouth and nose. Silas did not hesitate. He plunged into the river after her, the icy water taking his breath as well. He grabbed a handful of her dress, his other hand fighting the powerful current. With a desperate, primal roar of effort, he dragged her from the river's grip, pulling her onto the snow-covered bank on the other side. She was soaked, her body already racked with violent shivers. Hypothermia was setting in with terrifying speed. This was a new race, one not against a posse, but against time. "Ilara, stay with me!" Silas's voice was sharp with a fear she had never heard in it before. He worked with a frantic urgency, stripping off her wet, frozen clothes, his own hands clumsy with cold. He tore open his pack and wrapped her in their only dry blanket and the heavy bearskin. He rubbed her frozen limbs, his hands rough and desperate, trying to force life and warmth back into them. "You have to stay awake," he commanded, his face inches from hers, his eyes wild with fear. "Talk to me. Recite one of your poems. Anything." He knew it was not enough. He needed a fire. It was an immense risk. The smoke, or even the faint glow, could betray their position to the posse, but it was a risk he had to take. He found a small alcove in a rock face, sheltered from the wind. Using his knowledge, he built a small, careful fire with the driest wood he could find, constructing it in a way that would produce the least amount of smoke. As the small flames licked to life, he carried her to it, settling her on the bearskin and wrapping himself around her, adding his own body heat to the fire's meager warmth. The emotional climax of their flight happened in the slow, quiet hours that followed, as the feeling slowly, painfully returned to her limbs. Ilara lay wrapped in Silas's arms, listening to the frantic beat of his heart against her ear. The shivering subsided, leaving her weak and utterly spent. She was alive because of him. He had risked everything, plunging into the deadly river, lighting a fire that could lead their enemies straight to them. All for her. She tilted her head back and looked at him. His face, illuminated by the soft firelight, was etched with an exhaustion and fear that mirrored her own. But it was a fear for her, not for himself. In that moment, she understood the totality of his love. A love that was not spoken in pretty words, but demonstrated in desperate, life-saving action. "You would have died for me," she whispered, her voice a hoarse, broken thing. He held her tighter, his arms a circle of warmth and safety in the vast, cold wilderness. He looked down at her, his gaze intense. and all the walls he kept around his heart seemed to crumble. "There is no life for me without you in it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The simple, profound declaration solidified everything between them. This was no longer just a pact of survival, an alliance against a common enemy. It was an unbreakable bond, a commitment forged in fire and ice. They were no longer running from Alistair Beaufort. They were fighting for a future, for a life they could build together, if only they could survive to see it. Their ordeal, however, was far from over. As they clung to each other by the tiny, life-giving fire, their hard-won peace was shattered. A sound broke the stillness, the soft crunch of a boot on snow. Silas was on his feet in an instant, pushing her behind him, his rifle in his hands. 3 figures emerged from the snow-laden pines at the edge of the firelight. The man in the lead was gaunt and tall, with the dead, watchful eyes of a wolf, a tracker. He must have seen the faint glow of their fire against the rocks. The ensuing confrontation was not a prolonged battle. It was a tense, brutal skirmish that exploded in the quiet clearing. The tracker raised his pistol, but Silas was faster, his rifle shot echoing like a thunderclap in the silent woods. The tracker fell. The other 2 men charged, one with a knife, the other with a pistol of his own. Silas moved with the deadly grace she had seen in the carriage, a whirlwind of desperate motion. He used his rifle as a club, then drew his knife. There was a blur of movement, the grunts of men in brutal combat, the sickening thud of a blow landing. One of the men went down. The other fired his pistol wildly. The shot went wide, but a second shot followed. Silas cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled back a step. He finished the fight, incapacitating the last man with a final, desperate surge of strength. And then there was silence again, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Silas's ragged breathing. He stood for a moment, swaying, his rifle held loosely in one hand. Then he leaned heavily against a pine tree, his other hand pressed to his shoulder. Dark blood was already seeping through the thick wool of his coat. "Silas!" Alara scrambled to her feet and rushed to his side. He was wounded, bleeding. They were still a long way from any semblance of safety, and their journey had just become infinitely more dangerous. Without hesitation, she ripped a long, clean strip from the hem of her own petticoat. Her face, in the flickering firelight, was a mask of grim determination. The hunted had become the wounded. Her role, once again, had changed. The sharp report of the final gunshot faded, leaving behind a silence that was more profound and terrifying than the violence it had replaced. In that silence, the dynamic of their partnership was irrevocably broken and reforged. As Silas sagged against the tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps, Ilara's world narrowed to a single, sharp point of focus. Him. The fear was still there, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. But something else rose to meet it, a fierce, protective instinct so powerful it felt like a physical force inside her. She pressed the makeshift bandage of torn petticoat against his shoulder, her hands surprisingly steady. The dark, hot blood soaked through the fabric almost immediately. His face was pale, his eyes glazed with pain and the shock of the wound. He had been their guide, their protector, their strength. Now, he was bleeding in the snow, and all that stood between him and death was her. The society lady from the east was gone, buried somewhere back in the blizzard. In her place stood a woman hardened by the wild, a woman who would not let the man she loved die. The harsh wilderness that had been his domain was now her trial. She had to lead, she had to navigate, to find shelter, to keep him alive. The skills he had taught her were no longer lessons. They were tools for survival, and she wielded them with a desperate focus. She half carried, half dragged him away from the scene of the skirmish, following the stars he had taught her to read, heading west, always west. Their journey became a slow, agonizing crawl through a frozen purgatory. Every step was a monumental effort. She found them shelter in a shallow cave behind a frozen waterfall, a curtain of ice hiding them from the world. There, She tended to his injury. She boiled snow in their single tin cup to clean the wound, her hands gentle but firm. She remembered his lessons on plants, finding a patch of sphagnum moss under the snow, knowing its antiseptic properties. She packed the wound with it before binding it tightly with fresh strips of her dwindling petticoat. She learned to hunt. Silas, in a brief, pain-racked moment of lucidity, showed her how to fashion a snare from a bit of twine and a sapling. She set them along a game trail, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and revulsion. The next morning, she found a snowshoe hare in one of the traps. Killing it was one of the hardest things she had ever had to do, but the thought of Silas, weak and feverish, gave her the strength. She cooked the meat over a small, smokeless fire, feeding him small bites, watching him with an intensity that burned away her own exhaustion. Her love for him became her fuel, overriding the constant, gnawing presence of fear. It gave her a strength she never could have imagined she possessed. She was no longer just his partner. She was his fierce protector, his nurse, his anchor to the world of the living. Silas drifted on a painful tide of fever and delirium. He would lapse into unconsciousness for hours, his breathing shallow, his skin burning to the touch. Then he would surface, his eyes finding her, a flicker of recognition in their depths. In these lucid moments, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He would guide her. "Keep the sun on your left shoulder. In the morning," he would whisper, "look for the creek bed. It will lead you down from the high country." But it was his fever dreams that broke her heart. He would call out for his wife and son, his voice filled with a heart-wrenching anguish. "Sarah, the smoke! Get Jacob out!" he would cry, his hands clenching, his body thrashing in the throes of the fiery memory. My boy, my boy." Elara would hold him then, her arms wrapped around his trembling shoulders, whispering soothing words he could not hear, her own tears falling silently onto his fevered brow. She listened to this outpouring of his deepest grief, and she felt the full, crushing weight of the tragedy that had made him. She was bearing witness to the breaking and remaking of a soul. Days of this agonizing crawl bled into a week. She knew they could not go on like this. Silas was growing weaker, the infection in his shoulder a constant, draining poison. They could not outrun the posse forever. Sooner or later, Beaufort's men would find them. During a rare moment of clarity, his eyes clear and focused on her face, she made her plea. "We cannot stay in these mountains. Silas, they will find us. You need a doctor." He shook his head weakly. "No towns, no law. They're all bought by Beaufort." "There has to be somewhere," she insisted, her voice desperate. "Someplace he cannot reach." He was silent for a long time, his eyes closed. She thought he had slipped away again, but then he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Redemption," he rasped. "Small mining town, over the next ridge. The law there is thin. A man can get lost, or found." He looked at her, his gaze holding a flicker of the old fire. "It's beyond Beaufort's usual territory. Maybe someone will listen." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble against a society that would surely believe a wealthy land baron over a wanted outlaw and a woman they would label a hysterical, runaway bride. But it was their only shot. They would stop running from civilization and head directly towards it, armed only with the truth. They arrived in Redemption 2 days later, stumbling out of the tree line like ghosts. The town was a testament to its name only in irony. It was a bleak, muddy collection of rough-sawn buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. The main street a river of mire from the thawing snow. The air smelled of wet earth, pine smoke, and cheap whiskey. Weary miners with faces permanently etched with coal dust watched them from the porches of the saloon and the general store, their eyes suspicious and unwelcoming. They were a grim sight. Ilara's fine dress was in tatters, filthy and stained with his blood. Her hair was a wild, unkempt mane. Silas, pale and feverish, leaned on her so heavily she staggered under his weight. They were met with hostile stares, with muttered words and turned backs. These people saw a broken outlaw and his fallen woman, trouble they wanted no part of. Clinging to the last of her resolve, Alara guided Silas to the largest building on the street, which proclaimed itself a boarding house. Inside, she faced a stern-faced woman with eyes as hard as river stones. Alara reached into the hem of her dress, where she had sewn the last remnants of her old life. She tore the seam and produced 3 heavy gold coins. The sight of the gold softened the woman's expression from hostility to avarice. "We need a room," Alara said, her voice clear and steady despite her exhaustion. "And the best doctor in this town?" The doctor was a grizzled, whiskey-soaked man with hands that trembled until he had his morning drink. But his eyes were surprisingly sharp, and his touch was practiced. He cleaned and stitched Silas's wound, pulling a small shard of lead from the muscle. "He's strong," the doctor grunted, wiping his hands on a stained rag. "But the fever has a deep hold. It'll be a fight." He looked at Alara, his gaze softening with something that might have been pity. "But that ain't your biggest problem, Missy?" He gestured to the wall of the small clinic. Tacked there, stark against the rough wood, was a piece of paper, a bounty poster. It showed a crudely drawn but recognizable likeness of Silas. Beneath it, the words were a cruel twist of the knife. "Wanted for the kidnapping of Alara Vance and the murder of 2 private guards. $500. Signed, Alistair Beaufort." Beaufort had not just sent hunters. He had twisted the narrative, painting himself as the grieving, wronged fiancé, and Silas as the monstrous villain. Alara's hope for justice began to feel like a naive, childish dream. Still, she had to try. She went to the town marshal's office, a small, cluttered room that smelled of stale cigar smoke. The marshal was a cynical, overworked man with a drooping mustache and weary eyes. He listened to her story, his expression impassive. When she was finished, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "it is a known thing. A woman, taken like you were, can get confused. Her loyalties get twisted. She starts to sympathize with her captor. You have been through a terrible ordeal, mister. Beaufort is a respected man. This Silas Cole is a known outlaw. You should rest. We will see to it that you are returned to your fiancé safely." He dismissed her. He saw her not as a witness, but as a victim of a confused female mind, a sufferer of Stockholm Syndrome. She left his office, the cold reality of their situation settling over her like a shroud. They were trapped. The dark, tragic climax of their story unfolded the very next day. A rider brought word to the marshal. Alistair Beaufort was on his way. He arrived not with a posse of trackers, but with a small, private army of a half-dozen hired gunslingers and 2 corrupt lawmen from his own county. He did not want a trial. He wanted an execution. The town of Redemption, not wanting trouble, collectively held its breath and locked its doors. The weary miners and suspicious locals became silent witnesses, peering from behind grimy windows as Beaufort and his men dismounted in the muddy street, their faces grim, their intentions clear. They surrounded the boarding house. In their small room, Silas struggled to sit up, his face pale with fever but his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "Alara, you have to hide." "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "We are together in this." She helped him push the heavy wooden bedstead against the door, barricading them in. The tense, ugly siege had begun. From the street below, Beaufort's voice called out, smooth and honeyed, a chilling sound of possessive menace. "Alara, my dear, it is over. Come out now. You are safe. I forgive you for your confusion. This animal has poisoned your mind, but I will make you well again." Something inside Alara snapped. The fear, the exhaustion, the injustice. It all coalesced into a pure, white-hot rage. She strode to the window, pushed it open, and looked down at the handsome, monstrous man in the street below. She found her voice, and it was not the quiet, cultured tone of a society lady. It was the roar of a woman who had been pushed too far. "He is not the animal! Alistair!" she shouted, her voice ringing through the silent street. The faces of the townspeople appeared in the windows opposite. "You are! You murdered his wife and child! You burned their home to the ground because you coveted their land!" The marshal, standing on the porch of his office, froze, his head snapping up to look at her. "You bought me!" she screamed, the words tearing from her throat. "You bought me from my father like a piece of cattle to be branded with your name! This man saved me from you! He is more of a man in his sickness than you will ever be in your wealth!" Her words, filled with the undeniable power of righteous fury, hung in the air. A seed of doubt had been planted. The simple narrative of the evil kidnapper and the hysterical victim was shattered. Beaufort's handsome face contorted into a mask of pure rage. The pretense was over. "Take the door," he bellowed to his men. The final confrontation was brutal and personal. The heavy oak door splintered under the assault. Silas, using his last reserves of strength, stood with the empty rifle clutched like a club. The first two men who burst through the door were met with a desperate, fever-fueled fury. He fought like a cornered wolf, and for a moment he held them back. Then Beaufort himself stormed into the room. He saw Ilara, and his eyes were filled with a terrifying possessiveness. He lunged for her, but Silas threw himself in the way. They engaged in a desperate, violent struggle. Two men locked in a battle not just for their lives, but for the soul of the woman between them. At that moment, the marshal, his conscience finally stirred to action by Ilara's words and the blatant illegality of Beaufort's private war, burst in from the adjoining room, his own pistol drawn. "Beaufort, it is over. You are under arrest." The room was chaos. One of Beaufort's men raised his pistol toward the marshal. Beaufort, seeing his prize slipping away, drew a small derringer from his coat and aimed it at Silas's heart. A single gunshot rang out, deafening in the small space. For a terrible, silent moment. No one moved. Then Alistair Beaufort crumpled to the floor, a dark stain spreading across the front of his fine white shirt. The marshal's gun was still smoking, but justice had come at a terrible, bloody cost. Silas swayed, a fresh bloom of red blossoming on his chest. He looked at Ilara, a look of love and agony on his face, before collapsing into her arms. The world dissolved into the sounds of the marshal shouting orders, of Beaufort's men being arrested, but Ilara heard none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the man she held, his lifeblood seeping through her fingers, the fragile, slowing heartbeat she could feel against her cheek. The aftermath of the violence was not a storm, but a quiet, desolate haze. The echoes of the gunshots faded, replaced by the hushed whispers of the townspeople and the steady, shallow rhythm of Silas's breathing. He survived, but only just. The bullet, the marshal's bullet that had saved his life, had torn through his chest, missing his heart by a fraction of an inch. It was a wound that should have killed him. The grizzled town doctor, sobered by the bloody events and perhaps shamed by his own initial cynicism, worked with a tireless, grim devotion. He became a fixture in the small, bleak boarding house room that now smelled perpetually of blood, antiseptic, and despair. But the true vigil was kept by Ilara. She never left his side. Through long days that bled into endless nights, she sat in a hard wooden chair, watching the fragile rise and fall of his chest. Her entire world narrowed to that single, vital sign. The town of redemption, having witnessed the raw truth shouted from a boarding house window and confirmed by the ensuing violence, slowly, awkwardly, shifted its opinion. They were a hard people, not given to sentiment, but they understood injustice when they saw it laid bare. The story of the outlaw and his captive bride, the story that had begun as a piece of scandalous gossip, transformed into a local legend. It became a cautionary tale whispered over glasses of whiskey in the saloon, a story about the far-reaching evil of a powerful man and the improbable, ferocious power of love. The stern-faced woman who ran the boarding house began leaving trays of food untouched by the door. The miner's wife from next door brought a jar of rich, clear broth. They were small, silent gestures of solidarity, an acknowledgement of the trial by fire Ilara and Silas had endured in their midst. This time was a slow, painful exploration of healing, a journey that had to be taken in inches, not miles. Silas's recovery was an arduous, brutal battle fought in the dim light of the small room. There were long stretches of fever where he was lost to her, his eyes glassy and unseeing, his mind wandering in the smoke-filled ruins of his past. He would murmur his wife's name, his hands reaching for someone who was not there. In those moments, Ilara's heart would ache with a grief that was not her own, yet one she felt to her very bones. She would simply hold his hand, her touch a steady anchor, hoping to tether him to the present, to her. Then the fever would break, and he would surface, his eyes clearing. He would look at her, truly see her, and a flicker of the man she knew would return. He would be too weak to speak, but he would squeeze her hand, a silent communication that spoke more than words ever could. In those quiet moments of lucidity, their bond, which had been forged in the crucible of survival, was tempered in the gentle fires of care and patience. Ilara, too, had to heal. The trauma she had endured lived on in the dark corners of the night. She had nightmares that were a chaotic collage of terror, the suffocating white of the blizzard, the dark line of the posse moving across the snow, the splintering of the door, the final, deafening crack of the gunshot. She would wake with a silent scream caught in her throat, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But in the daylight, she was a pillar of strength. She buried her own fear, her own pain, deep inside, her entire being. Every thought and every action was focused on Silas's survival. Tending to him, keeping him alive, was the only thing that kept her own ghosts at bay. The legal ramifications of their ordeal unfolded with a slow, methodical pace. The marshal, a man named Jedediah Stone, had been transformed by what he had witnessed. He was no longer a cynical, overworked officer of the law, but a man with a heavy conscience and a newfound purpose. He became their unlikely, and most crucial, ally. Armed with Ilara's detailed testimony, he traveled to the county where Beaufort had held sway. He was met with a wall of fear and silence, but he was persistent. He found a retired ranch hand, a man with nothing left to lose, who was willing to talk about the rustling scheme. He uncovered land deeds with forged signatures. He found evidence of the fire at the coal ranch, a fire the local law had been paid to rule an accident. Piece by painstaking piece, he corroborated Silas's story, building a case not against him, but against the dead man he had been accused of serving. Weeks later, Marshal Stone returned to redemption. He walked into the small boarding house room where Silas was now able to sit up, propped against a mound of pillows. He held out a piece of paper. "The territorial judge reviewed my findings," he said, his voice quiet. "The charges against you for kidnapping and murder have been dropped. The bounty is rescinded. As far as the law is concerned, Silas Cole, you are a free man." Silas took the paper, his hand trembling slightly. He read the words, and Ilara watched a complex series of emotions play across his face. There was relief. Yes, but there was no joy. The victory felt hollow, a ghost of what should have been. Justice, they were learning, was not a triumphant moment of vindication. It was a quiet, somber reckoning, a legal document that could clear a name but could not mend a life, could not bring back the dead, could not erase the scars. As the weeks turned into a month, Silas slowly, painstakingly, began to regain his strength. The fever was gone, and the wound in his chest was beginning to heal, leaving behind a puckered, angry scar that matched the one on his jaw. He could stand, then take a few faltering steps across the room. With his returning physical strength came a heavy, pressing question. What now? They could not go back. Their old lives had been burned to the ground, literally for him, figuratively for her. Society, the world of laws and towns and polite company, held nothing for them. For Ilara, the East was a cage of family duty and stifling expectations, a place she could never return to. For Silas, the settled West was a graveyard of memories, a landscape haunted by the ghosts of his wife and son. They were outsiders, two solitary figures forever marked by what they had endured. Their place, they knew without having to say it, was with each other. They would have to build a life on the fringes of the world that had nearly broken them. A glimmer of hope. The first true and untainted ray of light since the ordeal began, appeared on a crisp, clear afternoon. It was the first day Silas was strong enough to walk outside, leaning heavily on Ilara, his steps slow and deliberate. He made his way to the boarding house porch. The air was clean and cold, and the muddy street of redemption seemed less bleak under the bright, benevolent sun. They stood there for a long time in silence, looking out at the distant, snow-capped mountains. The same colossal peaks that had once been their prison now stood as majestic, silent witnesses to their survival. The view was vast and beautiful. Silas turned his head and looked at her. His face was pale and much thinner than before, a roadmap of the pain he had endured. But as he looked at her, a small, genuine smile touched his lips, a smile that reached his eyes and filled them with a light she had not seen since the morning in the cabin, just before their world had shattered. "I never thought I would see another spring," he said, his voice still rough, but steady. Ilara felt a lump form in her throat. She leaned her head against his uninjured shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. Together, they watched the afternoon sun begin its descent, painting the high snowy peaks in breathtaking hues of gold and rose. It was a quiet, simple moment, but it was profound. In the warmth of the setting sun, in the steady presence of each other, they chose their path. They would not be defined by the shadows of their past, but by the light of a future they would build together. The story concludes months later, in the warm, gentle heart of early summer. A final, bitter irony had seen Ilara, as Beaufort's spurned but legally recognized fiancé, inherit a small portion of his vast, ill-gotten estate. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. They used the money, Beaufort's blood money, to purchase a small, remote plot of land in a secluded valley, far from any town, far from the reach of a world they no longer trusted. The valley was nestled deep in the mountains, a place of tall pines and a clear, rushing creek, reminiscent of the place where they had first truly found each other. But this was not a place to hide. This was a place to build. The final scene is one of quiet, unassuming peace. Silas, still moving with a slight stiffness but with a strength that grew more certain each day, was clearing a patch of earth near their new, small cabin. He worked with a steady rhythm, pulling large stones from the dark, rich soil, and placing them in a neat pile that would one day become a wall. His face was turned to the sun, and the lines of hardship were still there, but they were softer now, settled into a look of quiet contentment. Ilara was kneeling nearby, her hands deep in the soil. She was preparing a small garden, her fingers gently turning the earth, her mind filled with the names of the seeds she would plant: beans, squash, corn, and perhaps a few hardy flowers. The landscape around them was vast and wild, the mountains rising up to meet a brilliant blue sky. But it was no longer menacing. It was their sanctuary. Silas stopped his work and came to kneel beside her. He took her earth-stained hand in his calloused palm fitting perfectly against hers. They did not speak. Words were no longer necessary between them. They simply looked at each other, their faces illuminated by the warm summer light. All that they had endured was written there, in the fine lines around their eyes, in the quiet gravity of their expressions. But in their eyes, there was also a deep, unwavering love and a resilient, unshakable hope. They had found their warmth, not in a fire, but in the steadfast shelter of each other. It was a lasting warmth, forged in the coldest and cruelest of places, a warmth strong enough to see them through all the seasons yet to come. Thank you for listening. Comment where you are listening from so you can connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.